The chaotic, blaring sirens of the arriving ambulance did absolutely nothing to break my intense concentration. In the high-stakes environment of a premier Manhattan trauma bay, you quickly learn to shut out the deafening noise and focus entirely on the terrifying puzzle of a dying human body. The frantic paramedics were shouting out vital signs as they forcefully transferred the unresponsive patient from the transport gurney directly to the stark white hospital bed. Female 33 years old, unresponsive to initial field interventions, extremely diaphoretic, and violently seizing. I stepped smoothly up to the head of the heavy metal bed, snapping on a fresh pair of blue nitrile gloves. My eyes rapidly scanned the glowing cardiac monitor as the trauma nurses connected the tangled web of leads. The patient was thrashing against the thick leather restraints, her body convulsing in terrifying, erratic spasms. I reached out to securely stabilize her airway, gently brushing a heavy mat of damp, tangled blonde hair away from her face to accurately check her pupillary response. My breath instantly caught in my throat, and all the chaotic noise of the busy trauma bay seemed to vanish into a sudden, ringing silence. I froze, staring directly down at the contorted, agonizing face of the patient lying helplessly under the harsh examination lights. It was Chloe, my estranged younger sister. She was the undisputed golden child of our elite family, the flawless, massively famous wellness influencer, and the untouchable daughter of New York State Senator Richard and his powerful socialite wife, Margaret. Seeing her exactly like this, broken and violently seizing on a public hospital bed, shattered the pristine image my wealthy parents had viciously protected for her entire life. There was no time for personal shock. My rigorous professional instincts violently overrode my personal paralysis. I opened my mouth to immediately order the trauma nurse to prepare a heavy intravenous push of lorazepam to stop her brain from seizing to the fatal point of irreversible damage. Before the critical medical words could even leave my lips, a hand clamped aggressively down onto my right shoulder, exactly like a heavy steel vice grip. The physical force was so sudden and violent that I was yanked backward, my hip slamming hard against the sharp metal edge of a rolling medical supply cart. I stumbled slightly and spun around, expecting to see a panicked bystander or a disoriented psychiatric patient. Instead, I found myself staring directly into the furious, twisted face of my mother, Margaret. She was dressed in her immaculate designer gala gown, complete with heavy diamond jewelry that looked absurdly out of place amid the blood and intense panic of a sterile trauma bay. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated rage. Her chest was heaving aggressively as she glared violently at me, treating me as if I were a literal monster who had just crawled out of the dark shadows to attack her precious child. "Get your filthy hands off my daughter," Margaret screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, uncaring about the large audience of highly trained medical professionals freezing in their tracks around us. "You are a total dropout. You are going to kill her." She reached out blindly with her free jeweled hand and grabbed my father, Senator Richard, who had just rushed frantically into the busy room directly behind her. He stood there, frozen in his custom-tailored political suit, looking utterly paralyzed by the terrifying sight of his golden child thrashing violently on the hospital bed, and his permanently discarded daughter standing directly in front of him, wearing hospital scrubs. Margaret gripped his bicep with such terrifying ferocity that her sharp manicured nails dug straight through the expensive wool fabric of his dark jacket. I could literally see the sheer force of her intense panic, leaving dark bruises on his skin. "Richard, do something!" my mother shrieked, her incredibly shrill voice echoing sharply off the white tile walls and drawing the complete attention of everyone in the surrounding vicinity. "Tell them to instantly find a real doctor. A highly credentialed doctor." 4 long years ago, I would have shrunk away from that screaming. 4 years ago, the sheer, crushing weight of her profound disappointment would have forced me into silence. I would have hung my head, cried hot tears of shame, and passively let her publicly humiliate me into submission just to desperately keep the fragile peace in our image-obsessed, political family But 4 years ago was a different lifetime. The resilient woman standing in front of her right now had rigorously walked through hell to build a successful kingdom on her own. I did not cry, I did not flinch or cower in fear. I firmly stood my ground, confidently squared my shoulders, and calmly, but incredibly firmly slapped her hand completely away from my shoulder. The crisp, highly audible smack of my bare palm against her wrist echoed sharply in the sudden, heavy quiet of the trauma bay. My mother loudly gasped, recoiling as if I had physically burned her with fire, but the shock only fueled her intense vitriol. She just kept screaming, her hateful words spilling rapidly out, and filling the sterile hospital room with the destructive, fabricated lies she and Chloe had carefully constructed to permanently ruin my life. She stole our campaign money, Margaret yelled to the bewildered trauma nurses and attending staff who were looking between the two of us in confusion. She flunked out of medical school because she was far too stupid and lazy. She took $200,000 from her own father's political campaign fund to cover her debts and ran off to live in the gutter. As the highly trained nurses instinctively moved to protect the sterile medical field actively surrounding Chloe, my mother's unhinged, desperate ranting rapidly painted the entire agonizing, completely fabricated picture of my supposed public disgrace. According to her frantic, public shouts, I was a common, dirty criminal who had aggressively scammed my elite political family, entirely ruined my own future, strictly out of pure spite, and heavily deserved to be permanently cut off from their vast wealth and prestigious Manhattan social community. Listening to her scream those vicious, calculated lies brought the suffocating pain of the last 4 years rushing violently back to the surface of my mind. Because of the exact lies pouring effortlessly out of her mouth right now, my parents had completely refused to attend my residency graduation. I had walked proudly across that stage to accept my medical honors completely alone. They had vindictively boycotted my wedding to my supportive husband, David, leaving inside of the church venue empty on the most important day of my life. They had treated me like a venomous, contagious disease and wiped their hands clean of my existence. They fully and blindly chose to believe the saintly, public image Chloe had projected, while deliberately dragging my name through the mud to save herself. The truth, the cold, hard reality that my parents aggressively refused to accept, was that I never stole a single dime. 4 years ago, Chloe had secretly embezzled $200,000 directly from my father's political campaign fund to cover the massive, illegal gambling debts of her newly minted, tech billionaire husband, Julian. When the massive discrepancy was discovered by the campaign manager, Chloe panicked. My parents, terrified of a massive political scandal, ruining Richard's impending re-election bid, and destroying Chloe's lucrative wellness brand sponsorships, eagerly accepted the convenient scapegoat. They threw me directly to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Margaret pointed a violently shaking, diamond-clad finger directly at my face, her voice cracking as she loudly demanded that hospital security remove the dangerous imposter from the room before I murdered her only successful child. I looked my mother dead in the eye, letting the absolute silence of the trauma bay stretch out for one long, agonizing second. I did not yell back, I did not desperately try to defend my honor or explain the truth to the horrified nurses watching the spectacle. Instead, I reached up slowly, highly intentionally, and firmly tapped the heavy, gold-plated badge clipped securely to the lapel of my crisp white attending physician coat. I made absolutely sure she tracked the deliberate movement of my hand. I made sure she read every single deeply engraved word, reflecting brightly under the harsh hospital lights. Dr. Maya, MD Chief of Psychiatric Emergency Services, the color completely drained from my mother's face as the undeniable, crushing reality of those words finally set in. Her mouth hung slightly open, the hateful, toxic insults dying instantly in her throat, as she stared blankly at the prestigious medical badge of the daughter she had so easily thrown away. I did not give her a single moment to recover or formulate a new desperate lie. I turned my attention sharply to the massive hospital security guards who had just rushed through the double doors in response to the loud shouting. "Officers," I ordered, my voice carrying the absolute unquestionable authority of my senior position in this hospital. "Keep these two individuals completely away from my patient so I can actually save my sister's life." The two heavily built security guards did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They moved in perfect, practiced synchronization, firmly grasping my mother by the shoulders and stepping aggressively in front of my father. Margaret shrieked something hysterical about a massive, career-ending lawsuit, her voice cracking violently as they guided her forcefully backward toward the heavy double doors of the trauma bay. My father rapidly raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender, his face incredibly pale and slick with nervous sweat. He desperately tried to muster that booming, authoritative political voice that effortlessly commanded thousands of voters every single election cycle. But here, in the bleeding heart of my medical domain, he was completely, utterly powerless. "I want the hospital administrator." Richard barked weakly, struggling to maintain his slipping political dignity, as the security guards practically carried his thrashing wife into the corridor. "You cannot treat a sitting United States Senator this way." "Watch me," I replied coldly, turning my back entirely on the man who had traded his daughter for a clean polling record. Just as the heavy security doors were actively pushing my furious parents out into the busy public hallway, they violently swung inward again, nearly striking a terrified triage nurse holding a clipboard. Julian barged aggressively into the room. He was wearing a rumpled, ill-fitting designer suit that looked cheap despite the brand name. His face was flushed an angry, blotchy red, and his eyes darted frantically around the sterile room like a cornered, desperate animal. Julian was the Silicon Valley tech prodigy Chloe had married 5 years ago, the supposed billionaire genius whose wealth had blinded my parents to his profound, obvious character flaws. He rushed past the security guards, completely ignoring his weeping mother-in-law, and practically sprinted toward the reception desk, positioned just outside the main trauma bay glass. "I am taking her out of here right now," Julian screamed, slamming his fist violently onto the high counter. "Where is the billing department?" "I am transferring her to a private, discreet facility immediately." He was sweating, breathing, consumed by a manic, terrifying urgency that had nothing to do with genuine concern for his dying wife. I stepped out of the trauma bay, leaving the capable nurses to successfully stabilize Chloe's rapidly crashing vitals, and walked toward my panicked brother-in-law. "Julian," I said smoothly, my voice acting as a sharp knife cutting directly through his hysterical demands. "Your wife is currently suffering from a massive catastrophic overdose of synthetic amphetamines. If you move her, her heart will stop beating before you even reach the hospital parking lot." Julian spun around, his eyes widening in complete shock as he finally registered who was standing in front of him, wearing the chief attending coat. "Maya?" He choked out, completely bewildered. He rapidly shook his head, instantly dismissing my medical warning. "I do not care what you think you are doing here." He reached aggressively into his suit jacket, fully preparing to throw around his supposed massive wealth, to desperately silence the medical professionals. I watched him closely, my professional psychiatric training instantly recognizing the classic, undeniable signs of a man whose entire fabricated reality was actively collapsing around him. Julian reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, matte black credit card. He slapped it down onto the reception desk with arrogant force, staring at the billing nurse. "Maria, run it for 50,000, Julian commanded, his voice shaking with urgency. "That should cover the immediate deposit for the private transport helicopter and a VIP transfer team." "Do it now, Maria," a seasoned emergency room veteran, who was utterly unimpressed by shouting men in expensive suits, calmly picked up the heavy card. She slid it through the terminal reader. The machine processed for 3 seconds before emitting a sharp, negative beep. "Declined," Maria stated flatly, handing the card back. Julian stared at her as if she had just slapped him. He snatched the card from her hand, his face flushing a deeper, more dangerous shade of crimson. "Your machine is broken," he snarled. "That is an unlimited corporate account. Run it again." "I can run it 100 times, sir," Maria replied smoothly. "The system says the account is frozen. Do you have another form of payment?" The illusion of the brilliant Silicon Valley billionaire shattered right before my eyes. Julian tore frantically through the leather folds of his wallet, abandoning the high-tier metal cards, and pulling out a standard plastic debit card. He shoved it at Maria, his voice rising in pitch, entirely losing its previous smooth confidence. Maria tapped the digits deliberately onto the keypad, hit enter, and calmly turned the screen around so Julian could read the glowing text for himself. Declined, insufficient funds. Julian lost his mind, the reality of his empty accounts crashing down on him in front of his wealthy in-laws triggered an unhinged meltdown. He slammed his fist down hard against the edge of the reception desk, screaming that the hospital's billing system was a joke. Saliva flew from his lips as he berated Maria, calling her incompetent, demanding she call his private wealth manager, throwing a violent temper tantrum that echoed off the high ceilings of the emergency department. This was the exact catastrophic nightmare Senator Richard and Margaret had spent their adult lives desperately trying to avoid. A public, messy spectacle. I watched my father physically shrink into his tailored suit. Richard looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide with horror. Councilman Hayes and his wife, two of the most prominent political donors in his campaign district, were no longer casually sitting near the emergency exit, waiting for their grandson. Other people in the waiting room were turning around, whispering, pointing, and I could clearly see the bright telltale glow of cell phone screens as bystanders began recording the humiliating meltdown. Margaret reached out, her hands shaking as she grabbed Julian's arm, begging him in a harsh, desperate whisper to lower his voice. She reminded him of the voters watching, pleading with him to compose himself, to act like a gentleman, to call his bank quietly in the corner, so they could just pay the deposit and get Chloe out of this public place. She was still desperately clinging to the illusion that Julian actually had the money, terrified of the social ruin unfolding around her. But Julian was not listening. He yanked his arm out of her grasp. The reality of his declined cards had triggered a different, much darker panic inside his head. He stopped yelling at the billing nurse and spun around to face me, his chest heaving. His eyes were wild, darting frantically toward the heavy double doors of the trauma bay where his wife lay hooked up to a ventilator. I could see the terrifying realization clicking into place behind his eyes. If he could not pay the deposit for the private medical transport, Chloe would have to be transferred immediately to the standard public intensive care unit. And if she went to the standard intensive care unit, she would be under standard hospital protocols. That meant official, unsealed medical records. It meant a formal, documented toxicology report detailing her massive overdose on a lethal cocktail of illegal narcotics. It meant a permanent, undeniable stain on her official record that no amount of political money, spin or public relations magic could ever erase. Her pristine, highly profitable wellness empire was about to explode into a massive scandal, taking his fragile crypto operation down with it. Julian abruptly changed his demeanor. He smoothed down the lapels of his rumpled suit jacket, slicked his sweaty hair back from his forehead, and looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. He abandoned the argument about the bank error. He loudly declared that Chloe did not need to be in this incompetent public hospital anyway. He announced that he was taking her out of our care immediately. He demanded that I release her to his custody, right this very second, so he could arrange a private car. I stared at him, my expression completely flat, unmoved by his frantic demands. I calmly informed him that his wife was currently paralyzed by medical sedatives, relying entirely on a mechanical ventilator to push oxygen into her failing lungs, and that attempting to move her without a fully equipped mobile intensive care unit would be a guaranteed instantaneous death sentence. Julian did not care. The threat of her medical records going public outweighed the threat to her life. He puffed his chest out, stepping into my personal space, his voice dripping with venomous entitlement. He reminded me loudly that he was her legal husband and her primary medical proxy. Under the law, he stated he had the absolute undeniable right to refuse care on her behalf. He had the right to sign her out against medical advice, regardless of my medical opinion. He turned his back to me, practically climbing over the reception desk as he screamed at Maria to print the AMA release forms immediately. He demanded the paperwork, threatening to call the police on the hospital for kidnapping if we held his wife against his legal will. Maria hesitated, her hands hovering over her keyboard, her eyes darting toward me for guidance. She knew as well as I did that letting that woman leave meant letting her die. I gave Maria a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. She hit the print button, the machine whirred, spitting out the heavy stack of legal waivers. Maria placed the paperwork on the counter, sliding a black pen right to the edge. Julian snatched the pen up, a triumphant, manic gleam in his eye as he leaned over the desk, fully prepared to sign away his wife's life just to protect his own dark secrets. As the tip of his pen moved down to touch the final signature line, I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask for permission. I reached out and slammed my bare hand down hard flat across the clipboard, physically pinning the paperwork to the desk. "Give me that pen," Julian snarled, dropping his voice into a guttural threat as he tried to yank the clipboard free. "I am her husband. I am taking her out of this slaughterhouse right now." "You cannot stop me." "Actually, Julian, I can," I replied, my voice a deadly, unwavering whisper that cut through his bluster. And I just did. I pulled the clipboard out from under his reach and handed it back to Maria, who was watching the exchange with wide, approving eyes. I took a step forward, forcing Julian to back up. "You do not get to sign her out against medical advice to save your own miserable reputation," I stated, locking my eyes onto his sweating, panicked face. Closed toxicology report confirms a massive, deliberate and highly lethal overdose of synthetic opioids and amphetamines. Medically and legally, that constitutes a catastrophic self-harm event. Because she is an immediate critical danger to herself, I am officially invoking a mandatory 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. Richard gasped loudly from behind Julian. Margaret let out a muffled shriek, clutching her diamond necklace. "You cannot do that to your own sister," Margaret wailed, horrified at the prospect of the New York press, finding out the pristine wellness influencer was under a psychiatric hold. "I am the chief of psychiatric emergency services for this medical network," I reminded her sharply. I just did. Before my parents could launch into another desperate tirade, the heavy glass doors of the emergency room lobby slid open. The loud, commanding sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the tile floor. I looked past Julian's shoulder and felt a warm, anchoring sense of relief wash over me. Walking purposefully into the chaotic lobby was my husband, David. He was 35, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He was not just the man my parents had boycotted on my wedding day. He was a senior federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. And trailing closely behind him were two federal agents in dark windbreakers. David bypassed the gaping security guards and walked straight toward the reception desk, his eyes locking onto Julian with the cold precision of a predator zeroing in on a wounded target. "Julian Vance," David said, his voice carrying the calm, lethal weight of the federal government. Julian froze. He recognized David from the wedding photos my parents had undoubtedly complained about. He recognized the suit, the posture, and the distinct look of a man holding all the cards. "What is this?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking. "I am in the middle of a family medical emergency. You cannot harass me here. I am not here to harass you." "Julian," David replied smoothly, popping the latches on his leather briefcase. He pulled out a massive stack of official documents bearing the embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice. "I am here to inform you that your passports have been revoked." Margaret practically collapsed against Richard, her knees buckling. "What are you talking about?" "Richard, stop him." Senator Richards stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to leverage his political weight one final time. David, this is wildly inappropriate. You are harassing my son-in-law. I will have your supervisor on the phone in 5 minutes. And I will personally see to it that your career is over. David did not even flinch. He handed the thick stack of documents directly to Richard. Save your breath, Senator, David said coldly. My supervisor is the one who signed the arrest warrants. You should probably read page 4 before you make any more threats. Richard snatched the documents, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched the blood drain out of his face in real time. The arrogant, untouchable politician evaporated, replaced by a terrified old man holding the blueprint to his own destruction. Julian's tech empire is a ghost, David announced to the silent lobby, ensuring his voice reached the ears of the political donors, still watching in shock. There is no proprietary algorithm, there is no revolutionary crypto exchange. It is a massive, multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme built entirely on wire fraud. Julian stumbled backward, shaking his head frantically. Lies, it is a temporary liquidity issue. It is a federal indictment, David corrected sharply. And it gets worse for the family. David turned his attention to Richard, who was staring at the paper with trembling hands. 4 years ago, your daughter Chloe embezzled $200,000 from your campaign fund to cover Julian's initial gambling debts. Instead of reporting the theft, you blamed Maya. You disowned the only honest child you had to protect a scam artist. David stepped closer to the senator. But you did not stop there, did you, Richard? When Julian's crypto scheme started hemorrhaging cash last year, you panicked. You knew that if his company went bankrupt, the forensic auditors would find the original stolen campaign money. Margaret let out a horrifying sob, burying her face in her hands. You have been illegally funneling filgions of dollars in untraceable campaign donations through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, directly into Julian's failing business, to keep the illusion alive, David stated, delivering the final fatal blow. You laundered money to protect your polling numbers and your daughter's wellness sponsorships. The feds have the ledgers, they have the routing numbers. The reality of the situation hit the hospital lobby like a physical shockwave. Julian was broke. The senator was a money launderer. The golden child was overdosing on a public hospital bed. Margaret's knees abruptly gave out beneath her. She did not gracefully lower herself to the floor. She collapsed, hitting the polished hospital tile with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The pristine hallway, usually a sanctuary of hushed medical professionalism, became thus a stage for her absolute, undeniable degradation. Real desperate tears began to stream down her face. These were not the carefully manufactured drops she used to garner sympathy at elite fundraising galas, but ugly, gasping, chest-heaving sobs that tore violently from her throat. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, abandoning her lifelong obsession with dignity and poise. Her manicured fingers, heavy with diamond rings bought with laundered political funds, reached out and frantically grabbed the hem of my medical scrubs. She looked up at me, her expensive mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her pale, terrified face. "Maya, please," she wept, using my name with a desperate pleading familiarity she had withheld for years. She begged me to save them. She pleaded, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch, for me to write a massive check right now, to cover Chloe's immediate transfer to the exclusive Oceanfront Rehabilitation Center they used to quietly sweep societal scandals under the rug. She frantically promised that if I just loaned Richard the millions needed to replenish the drained campaign fund and pay off the federal investigators, they would eventually pay me back. She looked up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes, trying to invoke a moral high ground she had never once occupied. "We are family, Maya. You have to help us. It is your duty as a daughter," she wailed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. Richard remained on the floor a few feet away, too shattered to even join his wife's pathetic begging. He simply stared blankly at the crushed financial dossier resting by his shoes, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public moral and financial ruin. I did not pull my scrubs away from her grasping hands. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer a comforting word of support. I looked down at the woman who had discarded me like human trash to protect a lie. The woman who, less than 10 minutes prior, had viciously attempted to strip away my medical license and destroy my entire livelihood out of pure, unadulterated spite. I slowly knelt down, bringing my face perfectly level with hers. A frantic, desperate spark of hope flared in her tear-filled eyes, clearly thinking she had finally managed to manipulate my empathy. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was a quiet, perfectly controlled whisper meant only for her and the broken politicians sitting behind her. I do not have the space in my life for dropouts and thieves. It was the exact sentence she had spat at me 4 years ago, as she slammed the heavy oak door of their Manhattan penthouse in my freezing, terrified face. The light in Margaret's eyes died instantly. The breath rushed out of her lungs in a sharp, horrified gasp. She recoiled as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow, her hands dropping limply from my scrubs to rest dead at her sides. She stared at me, the devastating reality of her absolute powerlessness finally anchoring her to the cold floor. I stood back up smoothly, brushing out the fabric of my white attending coat, permanently severing the emotional tie to my abusers. I turned my back on my parents and addressed my charge nurse, Maria, who was standing near the nurse's station with wide, stunned eyes. I transitioned instantly back into the chief medical director. I delivered my orders with crisp, unwavering clinical precision, stripping the emotion from the room. Maria, the patient in Trauma Bay 1 is to receive standard basic medical care for her precipitated withdrawal. I instructed, my voice carrying clearly down the hall. No private suites, no specialized luxury accommodations. Furthermore, the federal authorities just confirmed that Julian Vance's corporate accounts have been frozen, and his credit cards have declined. The patient is uninsured. I am officially signing the transfer authorization forms right now. I picked up a digital medical tablet from the nearby counter, pulling up Chloe's chart. I pressed my stylus against the glowing screen with a definitive, binding stroke. The absolute second she is medically cleared for discharge from this intensive care unit, you are to move her directly to the state-funded public rehabilitation facility downtown. They have a crowded open ward system that accepts uninsured patients. Margaret let out a strangled, horrified gasp at the thought of her golden child, a woman who only wore designer silk and demanded private chefs being forced to recover on a plastic mattress in a crowded, underfunded public ward, alongside the very people she had spent her entire life looking down upon. I turned my attention to the chief of hospital security, who was standing silently behind David, waiting for my directive. You are to officially ban Senator Richard and Margaret from all private medical floors and administrative wings. I commanded, projecting absolute authority. They are to be escorted to the general public waiting area immediately. If they cause any further disruptions, or if they attempt to contact the medical staff, you are to remove them from the premises. I did not wait to watch the security guards step forward to haul my parents away. I did not look back at the wreckage of the people who had tried to destroy me. I simply reached out and slipped my hand into David's warm, steady, and incredibly grounding grip. We turned in unison and began walking down the long, bright hospital corridor. Behind me, Margaret finally shattered completely, letting out a harrowing, devastated wail of pure loss that echoed uselessly off the walls. From inside the glass walls of the trauma bay, the muffled sounds of medical monitors continued to beep, a stark reminder of the bleak, undeniable reality of Chloe's new existence. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung shut behind us with a firm, solid click, instantly muffling the noise, the drama, and the toxic history of my family. We pushed through the main exit doors of the hospital lobby, stepping out into the crisp, bright, and stunningly sunny Manhattan afternoon. The air felt incredibly clean in my lungs. We walked down the sweeping concrete steps toward the valet stand, where our waiting luxury SUV sat idling quietly. David opened the heavy door for me, a proud, protective smile on his face. I climbed into the soft, leather passenger seat, feeling completely and permanently free. The engine purred as we merged smoothly into the bustling city traffic, leaving the ruin of my past in the rearview mirror and returning to the peaceful, beautiful life I had built entirely with my own two hands. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift and brutal. Senator Richard was forced to resign in absolute disgrace. He was indicted on multiple federal charges of money laundering and campaign finance fraud, his political legacy permanently destroyed. Margaret lost her sprawling penthouse and her coveted position in the Manhattan social elite, forced to downsize to a modest apartment on a strict allowance managed by the federal courts. Julian's crypto scam resulted in a 20-year federal prison sentence. And Chloe, the golden wellness influencer, lost every single sponsorship she had ever secured when the details of her public overdose and embezzlement leaked to the press. She was forced to confront her demons on a plastic mattress in a crowded public rehabilitation center, completely stripped of her designer clothes and her fake billionaire lifestyle. The most profound takeaway from this narrative is that your true value is never determined by those who blindly refuse to see it. When toxic family members try to diminish your worth, weaponize your vulnerabilities, or manipulate you for their own selfish gains, the ultimate victory isn't found in bitter retaliation. Instead, true triumph lies in walking away, establishing unbreakable boundaries, and quietly building your own independent success. Bloodlines do not excuse abuse or entitlement. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional love. Whether they are biological relatives or a beautiful chosen community, you choose yourself. Share your own story of resilience and setting boundaries against toxic family dynamics in the comments below. And please hit like and subscribe for more empowering content. To truly understand the pure, unadulterated audacity of my parents demanding my help in that hospital lobby, you have to understand exactly what happened 4 years ago. It was the peak of the winter election cycle. New York was blanketed in a freezing, unforgiving layer of heavy snow, and my father's senatorial campaign was operating at a fever pitch. I was in my final grueling year of medical school, exhausted, sleep-deprived, and barely holding my life together. Chloe, meanwhile, had just married Julian in a multi-million-dollar wedding that my parents had proudly funded, plastering the extravagant photos across every major society magazine in the city. Julian was hailed as the next major tech visionary, a supposed cryptocurrency billionaire who was going to revolutionize digital finance. But Julian was a fake, behind the expensive tailored suits and the leased luxury sports cars. Julian was drowning in unpayable gambling debts. His revolutionary algorithm was vaporware, and his offshore creditors were starting to make terrifying physical threats. He needed an influx of untraceable cash immediately, or his house of cards was going to collapse. He could not ask my father directly. Richard was too obsessed with his polling numbers to risk associating with a failing business. So, Julian used the ultimate weapon, Chloe. Chloe had unlimited access to my father's primary campaign accounts, holding a position as the honorary director of fundraising. Late one night, panicked and desperate to protect her newly minted billionaire lifestyle, Chloe bypassed the dual authentication protocols and wired $200,000 directly from the campaign fund into an anonymous offshore account. She thought the massive transaction would go unnoticed in the chaotic flood of election donations. She was completely wrong. The campaign's senior financial manager flagged the missing funds less than 48 hours later. An internal audit was immediately launched, and the walls rapidly closed in on Chloe. Terrified of facing federal embezzlement charges and losing her pristine, carefully curated wellness empire, she devised a vicious, deeply calculated plan to save herself. She walked into my father's private home office, burst into manufactured, hysterical tears, and boldly claimed that she had caught me stealing the money. Her lie was a masterpiece of toxic manipulation. Chloe spun a tragic, deeply emotional narrative, claiming that I was secretly addicted to prescription painkillers, drowning in medical school debt, and intensely jealous of her perfect marriage. She sobbed, telling my parents that I had stolen her security credentials, initiated the wire transfer, and threatened to destroy her reputation if she exposed me to the authorities. I was completely oblivious to the rapidly unfolding disaster. I arrived at my parents' sprawling Manhattan penthouse that evening, carrying a small gift for my mother's birthday, expecting a quiet family dinner. Instead, I walked directly into an ambush. Richard and Margaret were waiting for me in the grand foyer, their faces cold and rigid with fury. Chloe stood behind them, wiping fake tears from her eyes, playing the terrified victim to absolute perfection. Before I could even take my heavy winter coat off, Richard hurled a thick stack of printed banking ledgers directly at my chest. The heavy papers scattered violently across the polished marble floor. "How could you do this?" Richard roared, his booming political voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You stole from my campaign. You stole from your own family. You are a disgrace." I stood there frozen, utterly bewildered, staring down at the scattered papers. "Dad, what are you talking about? I have been at the hospital for 36 straight hours." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes blazing with absolute contempt. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my face. "Do not lie to us, Maya," Margaret screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "Chloe told us everything. We know you stole the $200,000. We know about your disgusting pill addiction. Mom, I do not even have the access codes to the campaign accounts." I pleaded, my voice cracking in sheer panic. I looked desperately at my sister, hoping she would intervene and clear up the massive misunderstanding. "Chloe, tell them I was at the hospital." Chloe looked right at me, her eyes completely dead, devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. "I am so sorry, Maya," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling perfectly for the benefit of our parents. "I tried to protect you, but I cannot lie for you anymore. You need serious psychiatric help." It was in that exact devastating moment that I finally realized the terrifying truth. It was not a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate, calculated execution. Chloe had stolen the money to save Julian, and she was serving me up on a silver platter to take the fall. I tried to defend myself. I desperately offered to take a drug test right there in the foyer. I offered to pull my hospital badge swipe logs to prove my alibi. I begged them to hire an independent forensic accountant to trace the IP address of the wire transfer. But my parents did not want the truth. The truth was messy. The truth meant their golden child was a felon, and their billionaire son-in-law was a fraud. The truth meant a massive public scandal that would permanently derail Richard's political career. They needed a scapegoat, and I was the perfect expendable target. Margaret grabbed my heavy winter coat and violently shoved me backward toward the heavy oak front door. "You are no longer a part of this elite family," Margaret hissed, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated disgust. "We are covering the missing funds with our own personal money to avoid a federal audit. But you will never see another dime from us. You are completely cut off. Mom, please." I begged, the tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. "I have nowhere to go. I cannot afford my tuition without the family trust." Margaret looked at me with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the freezing winter storm raging outside the massive penthouse windows. "I do not have the space in my life for dropouts and thieves," she stated, delivering the final, fatal blow. She slammed the oak door in my face, the deadbolt clicking loudly into place. I was left standing in the freezing hallway, alone, stripped of my family, my financial security, and my support system. They genuinely thought they had destroyed me. They thought I would quietly fade away into poverty and failure, bearing the crushing weight of their dark secrets forever. They severely underestimated my resilience. I did not drop out of medical school. I worked 3 exhausting, back-breaking jobs to pay my tuition. I slept in the hospital on-call rooms. I studied with a relentless, burning fury that completely consumed my grief. And along the way, I met David, a brilliant, razor-sharp federal prosecutor who saw the absolute truth of my character and loved me fiercely. Which brings us right back to the hospital lobby, 4 years later, where the massive bill for their toxic betrayal had finally come violently due. The media circus that descended upon the Southern District of New York over the next 6 months was absolutely unprecedented. When a sitting United States senator is indicted on massive federal money laundering charges, alongside a supposedly visionary Silicon Valley billionaire, the press does not just cover the story, they devour it. Every single morning, a massive fleet of satellite news vans parked directly outside the federal courthouse. Reporters aggressively shoved microphones into Richard's face as he walked up the marble steps, desperately trying to ignore the barrage of questions about his stolen campaign funds. The trial was a spectacular, highly public execution of my family's pristine social facade. David, acting as the lead federal prosecutor, was an absolute force of nature in the courtroom. He did not shout, and he did not rely on flashy theatrics. He simply laid out the cold, undeniable mathematical facts. He presented the jury with a massive, organized visual map, connecting the anonymous Political Action Committee donations directly to the Cayman Island offshore accounts Julian used to funnel money into his failing crypto exchange. He played the wiretapped phone calls, where Richard frantically demanded that his campaign manager falsify the FEC disclosure forms to hide the missing $200,000 Chloe had stolen 4 years ago. I took the witness stand on the 4th day of the trial. Walking into that courtroom, I felt the suffocating weight of 1,000 eyes burning into my back. Margaret was sitting in the front row of the gallery, looking fragile, her designer clothes replaced by a muted, conservative suit. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, still unable to accept that her own toxicity had caused this disaster. I did not let her stare intimidate me. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the absolute truth, and methodically destroyed their entire defense. I testified about the frantic confrontation in the emergency room lobby. I detailed how Julian had aggressively attempted to sign Chloe out against medical advice, deliberately risking her life just to cover up the overdose and protect his fragile public image. I explained the medical necessity of the involuntary psychiatric hold, completely shredding the defense's narrative that I had acted out of malicious personal spite. When the verdict was finally read, the silence in the courtroom was incredibly. Julian Vance was found guilty on all 42 counts of federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. He stood trembling as the judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. The fake billionaire, the man who had arrogant thrown around his black credit cards and demanded VIP treatment, was permanently traded for a standard-issue prison jumpsuit. Senator Richard was found guilty of massive campaign finance violations, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The powerful politician, who had effortlessly commanded thousands of loyal voters and sacrificed his own daughter to protect his polling numbers, broke down weeping as he was sentenced to 10 years in a minimum security federal facility. The fallout for the rest of the family was equally catastrophic. Margaret's sprawling, multi-million-dollar Manhattan penthouse was seized by the federal government under the RICO Act to pay restitution to the thousands of innocent investors Julian had defrauded. Her coveted membership to elite country clubs was instantly revoked. Her society friends, the same people who had attended her extravagant galas, stopped returning her calls and blocked her number. Stripped of her immense wealth and her social standing, she was forced to move into a tiny, modest apartment in a loud industrial neighborhood in Queens, living on a court-mandated monthly allowance. Chloe's massive fall from grace was perhaps the most public and humiliating of them all. When the sealed medical records of her catastrophic overdose inevitably leaked to the press during the trial, her pristine, curated wellness empire exploded instantly. Every single major brand sponsor dropped her within 24 hours. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry, betrayed followers who realized her healthy lifestyle was a drug-fueled, fraudulent illusion. She was forced to spend 6 grueling months in the crowded, state-funded public rehabilitation facility downtown. She slept on a thin plastic mattress in an open ward, eating terrible cafeteria food, completely stripped of her designer silk robes and her private chefs. She had to sit in group therapy circles, with ordinary people struggling with addiction, finally forced to confront her massive demons without the protective shield of her family's political money. When she was finally medically cleared and discharged, she was completely broke. The arrogant, untouchable golden child, who had effortlessly stolen $200,000 and happily watched me get thrown out into the freezing snow, was abruptly forced to get a minimum wage job just to survive. She now spent her days standing under harsh fluorescent lights, working the checkout register at a mid-tier retail store, dealing with incredibly rude customers for 9 exhausting hours a shift. Fast forward exactly 12 months. The smog that had hung over my life had cleared. I was promoted to the prestigious position of Chief Medical Director for the hospital network, overseeing a staff of brilliant, dedicated healthcare professionals. My forensic medical research on addiction protocols was published in top-tier journals, and I was respected by my peers. David's brilliant, flawless execution of the high-profile federal trial had earned him a massive promotion at the Department of Justice. But the true, undeniable victory was not the prestigious professional recognition or the financial security we had built together. It was the absolute, unshakable peace that filled our home every single day. I stood on the wooden deck of our beautiful, quiet home in upstate New York, holding a warm mug of coffee. The early morning sun was just beginning to burn off the white mist hovering over the heavy pine trees. A few yards away, David was sitting on a rustic wooden bench, patiently showing our newly adopted rescue dog how to fetch a tennis ball. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the crisp, incredibly clean morning air against my face. I had not just survived the vicious, destructive storm my parents and my sister had tried to violently drown me in. I had walked straight through the fire, captured the lightning, and washed them away entirely. Margaret's transition from the pinnacle of the Manhattan elite to the gritty reality of a working-class neighborhood in Queens was a spectacular, humiliating crash. For decades, she had wielded her wealth and social influence like a weapon, destroying anyone who dared to question her pristine facade. She genuinely believed that her money insulated her from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own behavior. She was completely wrong. When the federal marshals executed the final asset seizure on her sprawling penthouse, she was allowed to take only 2 small suitcases of personal belongings. The massive collection of designer gowns, the priceless original artwork, and the heavy diamond jewelry were all catalogued, boxed up, and auctioned off by the Department of Justice to partially repay the thousands of innocent investors Julian had aggressively defrauded. Margaret moved into a tiny, incredibly cramped one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a walk-up building. The radiators hissed loudly during the night, and the constant rumble of the elevated subway line rattled the thin glass of her single window. It was a staggering, jarring contrast to the silent, climate-controlled luxury she had aggressively demanded for her entire adult life. She tried, initially, to maintain the arrogant, entitled illusion. She stubbornly put on her remaining silk blouses and marched down to the local corner bodega, as if she were strolling into a high-end luxury boutique on Fifth Avenue. She demanded premium imported water, organic artisanal produce, and custom-cut meats. When the exhausted cashier firmly told her they only stocked basic groceries, Margaret threw a massive, screaming temper tantrum, loudly threatening to call the manager and have the store completely shut down. The cashier simply stared at her, completely unfazed, and told her she could either pay for the cheap carton of milk or leave the store. For the first time in her life, Margaret was not holding a gold credit card. She had to slowly, painfully count out the crumpled paper bills from her court-mandated monthly allowance. The sheer, utter humiliation of realizing that her name, her legacy, and her demands meant nothing in the real world finally broke her. Her desperation drove her to pick up her cheap, prepaid cell phone and desperately dial the numbers of her former high society friends. She called Eleanor, the wealthy heiress who had co-chaired the annual charity gala with her for the past 10 years. Eleanor, Margaret sobbed into the incredibly cheap plastic phone, her voice shaking with intense panic. "It is Margaret. I need a small favor, just a minor loan until Richard's lawyers can sort out this massive federal misunderstanding." There was a long, incredibly awkward silence on the other end of the line. "Margaret," Eleanor finally replied, her voice dripping with the same condescending pity that Margaret had weaponized against me 4 years ago. "I am sorry, but Richard is a convicted felon, Julian is a fraud. My husband explicitly forbade me from associating with your family." The line went dead, leaving Margaret standing alone in her freezing, incredibly small apartment, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. The realization hit her with the brutal, undeniable force of a freight train. The people she had desperately sacrificed her own daughter to impress did not actually care about her. They never did. She had traded the only daughter who truly loved her for a superficial world that immediately discarded her the second she lost her pristine social standing. She was forced to live out the rest of her days alone, surrounded by the deafening noise of the subway, drowning in the bitter, painful reality of her own unforgivable mistakes. "Let me explain exactly how this happened," David continued, his voice ringing through the silent hospital lobby with the cold, absolute authority of a federal prosecutor. He looked directly at Senator Richard, who was visibly shaking, the thick stack of indictment papers trembling violently in his hands. "My task force spent the last 14 months quietly monitoring the blockchain ledgers associated with Julian's tech empire. You see, Julian, your proprietary crypto exchange was incredibly sloppy. You built a massive, flashing digital billboard that practically begged the Department of Justice to investigate you." Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the hospital exit. The 2 federal agents standing near the doors shifted their weight, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. The silent message was clear. There was absolutely nowhere to run. "We noticed a massive discrepancy," David explained, pacing slowly in front of the reception desk. "Every time Julian's exchange faced a catastrophic margin call, every time his investors were on the absolute brink of discovering that their money was gone, a sudden, anonymous influx of capital would miraculously flood into his offshore Cayman accounts. At first, we assumed Julian had found a desperate venture capitalist willing to cover his massive losses," David said smoothly. "But then we traced the routing numbers. The money was not coming from a venture firm. It was coming from a highly sophisticated network of political action committees, based right here in New York." Richard let out a low, terrified groan. Margaret covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her pale face as the pristine, untouchable facade of her wealthy political family cracked and splintered into a million pieces. "We subpoenaed the campaign financial ledgers," David stated, his eyes locking onto Richard with lethal precision. "We cross-referenced the anonymous PAC donations with your senatorial fundraising records. It was a perfect match. You were taking millions of dollars in political donations meant for your re-election campaign, running the money through a labyrinth of shell companies in Delaware, and illegally wiring the funds directly to your son-in-law to keep his massive Ponzi scheme afloat. You did it because you were terrified," David added, his voice dropping to a low, devastating register. "You knew that if Julian's company collapsed and the FBI launched a forensic audit, we would eventually trace the initial stolen funds right back to your daughter, Chloe. You knew we would find out. She stole the first $200,000 4 years ago, and that you deliberately framed Maya to protect your polling numbers. To cover up a minor theft, you committed a massive federal felony. You laundered millions of dollars in campaign funds, Richard. You betrayed your voters, you destroyed your own political legacy, and you sacrificed your innocent daughter, all to protect a fragile, pathetic illusion. The silence in the hospital lobby was absolute. The political donors, Councilman Hayes and his wife, were staring at Richard with looks of pure, unadulterated disgust. The cell phone cameras were still recording, ensuring that the senator's massive federal crimes would be broadcast across every major news network before the evening even concluded. My agents executed a coordinated multi-agency raid exactly 45 minutes ago, David announced, delivering the final fatal blow. While you were standing in this hospital lobby, screaming at the medical staff, the FBI was actively kicking down the heavy oak doors of your sprawling Manhattan penthouse. They are currently seizing your servers, your hard drives, your encrypted laptops, and your paper ledgers. Margaret wailed loudly, the sound tearing through the sterile lobby like a siren. The thought of federal agents tearing through her pristine, designer home, seizing her expensive jewelry, dragging her precious social standing through the mud, was too much for her fragile mind to process. Simultaneously, David continued, turning his sharp gaze back to Julian, the Securities and Exchange Commission raided the downtown offices of your tech empire. They seized the mainframes. The entire crypto exchange has been shut down and seized by the federal government. Every single bank account associated with your name, your company, and your political action committees has been permanently frozen. Julian fell to his knees, the expensive fabric of his rumpled suit sliding against the polished hospital tile. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly, the fake billionaire finally forced to confront the devastating reality of his own massive, unpayable debt. You are completely broke, Julian, David stated flatly. You do not have the $50,000 required to hire a private medical transport helicopter for your wife. You do not even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee from the cafeteria downstairs. Your corporate accounts are seized. David turned back to Richard. The senator was leaning heavily against the wall, his chest heaving, his face an alarming shade of gray. The powerful, booming politician had been reduced to a pathetic, terrified criminal in a matter of minutes. You will both be formally arraigned in federal court on Monday morning, David concluded, his voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy. Until then, I suggest you find a very good, incredibly expensive defense attorney who is willing to work strictly pro bono. Because as of right now you cannot afford one. David snapped his heavy leather briefcase shut, the loud click echoing sharply through the silent lobby. He turned his back on the ruined men and walked directly toward me, his expression softening instantly as he met my eyes. Are you okay? David asked softly, reaching out to gently squeeze my hand. I am fine, I replied, my voice steady, feeling a profound, incredible sense of closure washing over my entire body. I looked past David, watching Margaret crawl desperately across the floor toward me, her mascara running in dark tracks down her face as she prepared to beg for a financial bailout I would never, ever provide.